Good afternoon and welcome all of you. I apologize, I'm just going to have to do a few things here in the tech department, but then we should be on our way. So welcome once again to our study of Steven Goodman's The Buddhist Psychology of Awakening. And we're looking at what's helpful in terms of qualities that are constructive and also awareness of qualities that are not so destructive. And this is rather significant because very often with, as I think I mentioned earlier, with the spiritual path, there's sometimes this sort of rather sweet notion that in the spiritual realm, then you just focus on what's good and you don't necessarily deal with the dark side. And this is certainly not the case in Buddhism. We're very much dealing with what is. We're very interested in what is rather than what should be. So that's where the project of enlightenment is seen not as something that where we replace the evil with the good, but rather where we see through a basic condition of confusion that is constituted by a lack of awareness, and we replace that with an awareness that where we actually become clear on what's happening within ourselves, and also discovering that there's a lot of wiggle room with regards to what is within ourselves. We might have all sorts of impulses and all sorts of habitual patterns that are not necessarily that constructive, but that's actually not the issue. It's more about, should we tag along with it or should we actually face up to it? So it's not so much about us replacing one style, one narrative with another narrative, but rather us just becoming aware of what's happening and also discovering within that awareness a freedom to actually choose. So of course we talk about how karma, it is something that that delivers everything that we experience. You could say basically everything that we've done in the past naturally has left imprints. But at the same time, we also see that what we make of that and where we go from here, that's up to our present actions. So of course, again, taking karma into account, our present actions might to a large extent be fueled by just conventional ways of seeing things, ignorant ways of understanding things, things which are just convenient for us because we're a bit lazy, and in general, a sort of a sense that we can't do much about what we are. And that's exactly what we're replacing here with an awareness of what we contain. And particularly also with the practice of meditation, we discover that there's space in which we needn't necessarily tag along with everything that arises in the mind. So we are in effect dealing with an incredibly profound project. And we really actually would wish that this discovery, this insight, this science, this path that the Buddha offered would be understood more widely and not, unfortunately, associated with the idea that what we're doing here with the Buddhist path, it's a way to find meaning, it's a way to sort of re-enchant our existence. It's a lovely thing to do, that we might find peace and all of that, but actually understand that we're not that poverty stricken. We actually possess a foundation that is brilliant, and that is what the Buddha discovered, and that is what the Buddha communicated, and that is where we're not just finding a way to become peaceful, compassionate persons, but we're actually getting to the very bottom of the greatest mystery there is, which is the mystery of our existence, the existence of reality, and so forth. So that's where in this study we really approach this not as a study of Buddhism, but as a study of the conditions that rule not just us, but every sentient being everywhere. And out of deep concern and caring, that we then will educate ourselves in terms of clearing up our own confusion so we can be there for others. And that is then the Bodhisattva's motivation when we approach this. This is what we call preparing with Bodhichitta. And this is something that we do when we study, it's something we do when we practice, it's something that we have when we're interacting with others, and it's something that in general is enormously valuable in all situations. So simply just check our motivation, and if we have this motivation of caring, this completely shifts the energy and the dynamics in any situation that we engage with. So we're going to look at the present topic, which is we're presently looking at primary factors of upset, and this is what in Buddhist lingo is understood as kleshas, or conflicting or destructive emotions, and essentially conditions that drive agitation, unhappiness, disharmony in ourselves and others. And we could approach this in a very neutral way and just saying, well, this is what it is, you know. So we understand that this is the way that you could say the energy of our mind, when it's filtered through what we call ignorance or confusion, then it generates this dynamic of self versus other. And when this operates then from a place of continually just thinking of me and the other as merely as an object of me, then we operate with these afflicted attitudes, and we could say we essentially are propagating this very afflicted, destructive policy in relating to the world. So that's why we need to be aware of these conditions that we deal with and deal in our interaction with the others, and also basically seeing this as something that is toxic to ourselves. And of course, the implication here is that we can do something about that. So first we identify it, you know, there's a problem and we can deal with it. So we've looked at the primary factors of upset, which are these 6, namely attachment, anger, arrogance, ignorance, doubt, and, well, opinionatedness, I guess we should stick to, or belief. And these are the basic ones. And then we're looking at then the secondary, as Stephen puts it, the sort of the progeny or the children of these 6. So we looked at fury, resentment, concealment, and today then we're going to look at spite. So let's see here. Let's go back to this beautiful forest. This is apparently somewhere in Belgium. So it's not how I usually think of Belgium. So this is a nice alternative to how we might normally think of Belgium. It certainly doesn't look like Brussels. Anyway, spite. So spite is a vindictive attitude preceded by a feeling of being indignant and a feeling of resentment. When we feel indignant, when we think, how dare they, and then feel resentment thinking, I don't like that, and that, we have an energy of wanting to get back at those who have wronged us. It's very much connected with anger. Now, I'd like to say that as we study this, we can't do this as an academic study. We can't sit and think, aha, that happens to some people. There has to be a place where each and every one of us identify this as taking place within ourselves, within our living experience, and where we have that. So it's very important that we don't theorize or theoreticize this and just leave it as an abstract. This is something that hopefully we all can recognize as, yes, that does take place in me. We need to have that. Anything that we are actually studying in Buddhism, we have to always relate it with our personal experience. It's no good saying, well, I'm not an angry person, or I'm not a spiteful person. This we do socially, you know. Oh yeah, that person was so spiteful. I wouldn't have done it like that, you know. Very sort of righteous, you know. The faults are with the others. In Buddhism, the faults are with ourselves. Not in the sense of that we're bad, but just that we're aware humbly of what we can deal with. And we can't really do much about the others, I'm afraid, unless we want to sort of, you know, be one of these annoying persons that goes around and points out the shortcomings of others. Then everything that we're talking about in the Buddhist path in terms of the destructive habits, we have to actually apply this to ourselves. So that's where we need to identify these things in terms of our personal experience and in terms of our personal ability to deal with that. So this is then where we need to recognize spite and anger. And Steven says this serves as a basis for letting loose harsh and strong words with our mouth. That is where we then say rude things to others. And we might even afterwards say, I said so-and-so, I said this to so-and-so, and then we're kind of proud of it, you know. We let them know, you know, and that's not that helpful. In extremely rare cases, by great bodhisattvas, then wrathful actions, wrathful words might just hit the mark and change things in a constructive way. But for the rest of us, it really just doesn't work. We become weak and we look pathetic. And even though we might manage to bully somebody or something into changing their way of action, there's absolutely no reason for us to ever feel pleased about having said something rude to anybody else. So that's where we need to recognize this tendency that we might have, and if it has ever come out, then we should sort of apologize or somehow just recognize this is not a pattern that we wish to continue. So on the one hand, this spite and anger increases unwholesomeness, and on the other hand, no matter how harsh we are on others, it bounces back on us and we don't feel happy. Again, we could be very insensitive and just sort of go, yeah, you know, I got to them. but then we have to be very alienated to ourselves and we have to be very insensitive to others, and otherwise we would be experiencing something that is definitely not a good place to be. So being there, he says, we have no intention of making a clean break with this whole thing. We're still part of the problem. That's why we want to sort of stay in there. Yeah, I don't like so-and-so because so-and-so did this and that. We are still part of the problem. Many Buddhist texts warn about reviling or criticizing with harsh words or engaging in ridiculing others. It's a very prevalent factor. Jealousy/envy. Then we come to jealousy or envy. The first thing that is said about jealousy is that it is a highly disturbed state of mind, as if it is a bit more dangerous or powerful than some other secondary factors of upset. Vasubandhu also indicate that jealousy is strongly associated with hatred and aversion. It takes as its point of generation, not being able to hear about the well-being or excellence of other people. We hear about the good qualities of another and we hear this little voice saying, what about me? When do I get the medal? When do I get the loving smile? It says this is caused by overly attached to gain and honor. you will remember the famous list of the 8 worldly motivations. And this again is something rather familiar. I remember Dilgo Khyentse once saying, you know, you should never compare yourself with others. And that's where we get jealous. We think, I fall short of so-and-so, or, you know, so-and-so is getting this and I'm not getting it. You know, I mean, jealousy comes in many different kinds of situations, and sometimes it can be pretty overwhelming, but it's always something that is profoundly destructive and which really profoundly, how do you say, obscures us. Steven writes, its result, its function, is that it makes us really unhappy. And this, by the way, this term function is really a key term in Buddhist studies. Any psychological factor is understood as having a function. Any element on the path is understood in terms of things like its nature, its aspects, and you'll come across this notion function. And it basically means the implication, or the, not implication, but the effect that it has. So function is also a very neutral way, and just saying, well, the function of jealousy is to make us unhappy. That's exactly how it functions. So that's where we have a very neutral way of just identifying that this thing works in this way. So it's not even about particularly a value judgment, it's just identifying function. Furthermore, he says, in terms of function, it blocks happiness. We know the antidotes to jealousy. Rejoicing in the good deeds and the merit of others is one of them. So we see other people doing great things, and instead of saying, gosh, you know, maybe they're ahead of me in terms of the path or whatever, and rather we're just happy that somebody's doing something that's constructive. We notice it. It makes us happy. Another antidote to jealousy is the capacity to cut through to the root of the idea that there are others out there who are more special and more important than I am. Once again, this famous I appears. It rears its little vicious head and then says, I am less important. I have a problem with other people's success. We think there is an I, and later there is a problem. We experience that, but this is exactly where we need to begin to work with this cognitive dysfunction, because the I has never existed. The I is a delusion. The I doesn't exist in nature. The I is something that we conjure up from the place of ignorance. And this is not a vague notion. This is the entire science of the 12 links of dependent originalism. This is the entire link of the 5 skandhas. This is something that needs to be known. But the bottom line is that on the basis of this knowledge and insight, we're going to be discovering that actually there is no self. This we need to be clear of. Not just as a vague mystical experience that might land us as one day, but on the basis of initially analysis, seeing that actually there's no basis for this sense of I. Then also in terms of an intuitive appreciation, which is then where we can see that actually we function much better and we're much happier when we're not prone to our selfishness, when we are aligned with an awareness of the others, when we're naturally more compassionate, accepting, etc. We can see that in terms of our intuitive appreciation, there are very clear indications of how we're much better without the fixating on self. So we can see there's a very clear way in which the two ways of handling ourselves, by self-centering or by selflessness, there's a very big difference in terms of what we subscribe to, so to speak. And that's where belief has a lot to do with it. We might actually think, I should look out for myself. And all this Buddhist rubbish about selflessness, it just doesn't work. That's why we need to really be clear and actually engage in an analysis. Could it possibly be true, giving the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas some benefit of the doubt? And that's where we need to get to the bottom of this issue of self and really understand what we mean with selflessness. I was just listening to Jakob, and he was making this point that this absence of solidity in terms of our person and in terms of the phenomenal world, this is so important that we really understand that. Without that, the practice of meditation is a little bit unclear. It might, of course, have some beneficial sort of effects on us, but we really need to understand what it is that we're addressing. So that's where this I is not just about a moralistic sense, oh, I should be selfless, like a good little Buddhist. That's not at all what it is. But we need to stop being delusional. We need to sort of we need to wake up. So that's where this issue of the self is something that we need to identify and deal with. So Steven says, we think there is an I, and then later there is a problem. But from these perspectives, the I is already the problem. And so it goes round and round, the circle of samsara, fueled by this rigid fixation on I. Okay, there's a question. Regarding jealousy, I know this is prevalent in sanghas. Yes, it happens in sanghas. It does happen in a lot of places. Yeah. How do we function when we know that this arises in others? Well, I think we initially need to abandon the idea that it's different in particular groups. It's universal. And it's really mainly about us identifying it in ourselves. I have often felt that I need to walk on eggshells around people, but surely we can't live our lives like that. It happened when I met Tansa Jamikins Rinpoche last year in Australia. The reaction I got from a member of the Sangha was very mean girl attitude. And this was one of many such occurrences. So what do we do? Keep to ourselves, not sharing anything with anybody? Yeah, this is sad. You know, there's a lot to be said about this. I very often think that what happens, you know, people come to Buddhism with a good intention, but then what happens is they idolize the teacher and they demonize the Sangha. You know, the teacher is wonderful, but all those other annoying people, right? But you know, it's not just in the Sangha, it's also anywhere that something extraordinary is taking place, and there's possibly somebody who's, you know, you could say, well, objects or persons that are worth hanging out with, you know. So that's where people might think, oh, so-and-so has a lot of money, or so-and-so knows the right people, you know, so-and-so knows how to sort of weasel their way in with the sort of higher echelons of power, etc., etc. It's really a universal phenomenon. And at that time, we always come across this competitive thing. And it's not just in the Sanghas, but you could say it's particularly disappointing because supposedly in the Buddhist context, we all should be wonderfully enlightened. And well, you know, I think we quickly find out that the Sangha is a group of people who have set out on the path, but we've arrived at different places. So we shouldn't expect people to have gotten that far. And then in a way, that's a relief for us, well, because in case we're not very far ourselves, then we can just say, oh, well, there might be somebody who's just like myself, also still struggling with the initial issues. But of course, I understand that these kind of upsetting things do take place. But I think, first of all, it's universal. And second of all, I think we're just going to have to be patient. And yes, we do have to walk on eggshells. We do have to be sensitive to other people. And we, you know, it's not our duty to relieve people of their ego. You know, we can't say, hey, you're supposed to be a Buddhist. You're supposed to not have jealousy. We can't really do that. Yeah. And so, yeah, so we just have to be careful. That's it. And, you know, when we're sensitive to others' neuroses and other things, then we just go along with it. It's not our journey our job to eliminate their egos. That's the gurus and their own problem. And so we should just, there will be sensitive egos, and then we're just going to have to accommodate that. And there will be some persons that they're chilled and you can talk with them, and others you can't. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Yeah. But okay, again, also a good attitude to bring to this situation is that just recognize there's a place. Everybody, even the sort of the mean people, they have had the inspiration to engage in the path, and have the inspiration to engage in the path, and you know, they might be struggling, and you know, but just have sympathy. I guess the best we can do is have sympathy and respect for the others, and they might be undergoing various afflictions in this regard, but we need to be sympathetic. Yeah, we should definitely conceal things so that we don't make others upset. Absolutely, and that's normal. You know, we have to do that everywhere in the world, really. You know, so this also applies here. But at least with the Sangha, we actually I always quote Chögyam Trungpa with regards to Sangha, where he said something that I thought was very profound. And he says, Sangha is one person giving up their territory, and through doing so, inspires another. So us beginning to be gentle, accepting, might inspire others. We can't bully them, or we can't change them, or we can't, you know, we might just inspire others, and we can do that through being gentle and understanding that, yeah, certain things you just can't talk with certain people about, and so be it, you know. So, stinginess, avarice. Stinginess or avarice is defined as being overly concerned with and being overly attached to physical things in this life, because somehow we think there is a relationship between physical things and our honor. That's right. We think that we're better people if we have more, and we have greater value if we have possessions. We think that being well thought of has something to do with things that we have or things that are associated with us. This factor is connected to passion or lust, the desire to have those things. How does this avarice function? It is continuously feeding on itself. We become continually obsessed by material things. We're attached to the body and to what the body may accumulate. We have no thought for what might happen once this wonderful body is gone. Yeah, so we can meditate on impermanence. We should also really see how avarice and stinginess actually constructs ourselves already in the immediate. Because the moment that we are defining ourselves in terms of what we can bring to ourselves, in terms of stuff, or in terms of even credentials or whatever, we realize that we're actually operating from a very poverty-stricken perspective. And the moment that we are perpetuating this, we deepen this sense of poverty. So the ability to give freely counteracts that. And the degree to which we stick to practices of stinginess and so forth, this deepens this poverty. So that's where we could, of course, when we're talking about karma, we can talk about this in terms of the moment that we sow the seed, where we can even at that moment see how we're constructing our own psychology. And we can also see it in terms of the ramifications it will have. So the moment that we're perpetuating this sense of poverty, I need this, you know, to be a worthy person, you know, I need more, then we're increasingly constructing ourselves as poverty-stricken individuals. And that, while we right now have circumstances where we might have these things, the moment that we let go of this body, then the mind will construct a world of such poverty. And that's why we talk about rebirths as hungry ghosts, or rebirth in conditions of poverty, etc. Because that's where we then, as a consequence, begin to experience this in terms of the realm. So that's where the identifying this in terms of our present psychological disposition is really important. And of course, also then thinking in terms of the karmic ramifications. Deceit, pretense. Deceit or pretense is our capacity to display what is not real. We are pretenders. In a slightly different context, Jean-Paul Sartre once said that one of the characteristics of being human is having the capacity to learn how to lie. This is interesting because it means there is some basis for distinguishing what is true and what is not true. So in other words, we know when we're lying. But it is also often that this human trait is somewhat covered. And for some individuals or some of us at some times, we might be blind to the fact that we're actually perpetuating deceit or perpetuating lies. We might be profoundly involved in self-deception. So that's why sometimes also we're blind to that. But the bottom line is that, of course, we are in conflict with reality. And so Steven goes on to say, deceit and lying are unwholesome. But at the basis of this unwholesome display is our knowledge of the difference between what is real and what is not real. Or let's at least hope there is such a knowledge. Deceit involves our capacity to make others feel that what we are displaying is real. There we are, masquerading. This is associated with both passion and lust, but also with bewilderment. We may enjoy doing this. We may enjoy deceiving others. So this, of course, this is a theme very often in the arts, right? Where we have incredible con artists, colorful con artists, and also persons that even become, you could say, charismatic, successful persons on the basis of essentially practicing deceit. So we sometimes even have a rather romanticized relationship to this whole practice of deceit. So Steven continues, we see the effect it has on other people. That is the passion. But the bewilderment is the fact that we don't understand that this does not do us any good. And that's, of course, also what very often is the sort of punchline in some of the dramas we have around deceit and so on. But this can go on unchallenged to a very large extent. But yes, the bottom line is that we're simply at odds with reality, and hence we're going to be uncomfortable in reality. We might, for the time being, be able to conjure up some non-reality, but eventually reality will come and bite. It won't do us any good. Steven says, this factor of deceit, this act of displaying what is not real and enjoying it while being unclear that it isn't doing us any good, is also very closely attached to beliefs about wealth and honor. Again, coming back to belief. Yeah. Sort of poor boy pretending to be, a rich person, So when we cultivate this, it results in a whole lifestyle based on deceit. Because these lifestyles do not correspond at all to walking out of suffering, they are referred to as perverse or wrong lifestyles. Simply, we're at odds with reality. We always, sometimes we see this happen when people are so poverty-stricken that they're perpetuating these beliefs. It's cringe-worthy. We sort of feel sad for persons involved in that, or if we ourselves are doing, we know how uncomfortable this is. And we also hopefully have some sense of the relief actually that lies in coming clean. That we might have sort of painted ourselves into a corner of lies and deception, and suddenly we realize this is absolutely, profoundly, destructive and perverse. And then actually we can see we just got to stop it. And that's where we actually can come clean. And this is such a relief. Anyway, Steven says, here is a list of perverse lifestyles that follow from deceit. There is the lifestyle that consists of hypocrisy. Everyone who cultivates this lifestyle knows that one is a hypocrite with other people. So we know from within. Others might know it too. We can find this in business. You say he is a hypocrite. You can't believe what he said. But the other person says the same about you. Still, you have meetings and you make business deals, but it doesn't make you very happy. Another lifestyle is based entirely on flattery. The flatterers get together and they have their flattery meetings. You talk smooth and you only say agreeable things, but you want something from it. Again, that's kind of closely aligned to the above. Then there are people who are overly praising. They go over the top all the time. The text says, first you start with flattery, and then you heap praise upon praise. You praise people's possessions because you want them. So again, this is where we're not doing it because we are happy to see some qualities in others, but we have an agenda. We want something from these people. Let's see what the comment here is. Steven says, this is a complete teaching on the world of finance, right? It is a world in which evaluation of other people is based entirely on what they do or might possess. Yep, and how they appear. Yeah, okay. 4. Another lifestyle of deceit involves those who seek wealth by means of wealth. This refers to those who brag about what they have by saying, this great person blessed me. He gave me these things. You're using the wealth of words to attract wealth and attention to yourself. This also actually, I think this happens everywhere, right? This also happens we were talking about Sangha before, right? I just spent time with this very important spiritual person, and this person gave me this, and so on. And this is where we also then need to be skillful. And if we have been very often, actually, just coming back to the Sangha discussion, very often in Tibetan context and other Buddhist contexts, very often, well, of course, the usual happens, but also I've noticed with great practitioners, they actually don't mention if they've been, seeing great people, or if they've received something from somebody important, they don't mention it. And so this is also, of course, this also applies. Actually, if we look even in the world of finance, you very often find that the most powerful persons in finance and in general worldly secular contexts, they very often are very powerful because they know the art of, you can say the real power actually lies in not bragging and not displaying and so forth. Anyway, this sort of the poverty implicit in this deceit is what we're talking about here, and we can see how it actually is counterproductive. Where's the line between deceit and lies and the secrecy that is expected in the Vajrayana that Tongsa Khyentse Rinpoche talks about in his recent book, Poisonous Medicine? Well, that's where I would say read the book, and probably Rinpoche has a very good answer to that. This very much could become sort of how we define sort of the subtle differences between these things. But Rinpoche in this book, I think he spelled it. I would leave it to Rinpoche to fully sort of explain that. How to not compare ourselves with others. It seems not that easy for me. Well, okay. Is it true that as long as we are dualistic, there is you and I, we would easily tend to compare each other? Thank you. Yeah. So the first part of your question, it seems not easy for me. Well, I can tell you it's not easy for me either. So that makes two of us. But it's something that we can work with even at the level of being dualistic persons. And that is where we can train in simply identifying the value of not comparing ourselves with others. That's where we could be we're helped by Lojong teachings and teachings that work with training the way that we think about things. So we're still just on the in the context of relative truth. But we could think in terms of just thinking, gosh, this was my parent from a previous life, and I'm so happy that this person is doing well. We can identify how this comparison and jealousy comes up, and then we can bring in this other narrative that is an alternative narrative that says, gosh, I'm really happy that this person gets what they want, and train in that. You know, we trained ourselves in the other one for a long time, the one of resentment or deceit and what is it again? Comparing ourselves with others. That we've trained in for a long time. So let's train in another one, the one in which we rejoice for others. They're equally dualistic, but one begins to open up, and the other one closes us down. And it's then that on the basis of the one that opens us up through Lojong practice, through rejoicing that others are doing better than we are, have more than we are, etc., etc. That's then where this is what we call the accumulation of merit. Then we can come to the accumulation of wisdom, where we, on the basis of that, begin to have the circumstances in which we could engage with the space, the unconditional space in which the constructs of self and other, they begin to collapse. So we really work with these two in terms of the path. You could say post-meditation is very much about working with the conceptual mind, and meditation is where we practice then settling the mind in wisdom. Hypocrisy, dishonesty, closely related to deceit. The eighth factor is dishonesty. One desires wealth and honor, and based on this desire, confuses what is unwholesome with what is wholesome. This dishonesty works in tandem with deceit. The function of dishonesty is to conceal your shortcomings because you don't want your honor to decline. So this is again where Milarepa, he says, my Dharma tradition is to be free of deceit, self-deceit, but also deceit. Stephen writes, you try to keep your mistakes a secret, but when people find out, you become a bit meek and a bit more prudent, like we've been busted. So that's where there's actually something very, I remember one of my teachers, Tuku Pema Wangel, he talked about these kind of embarrassing moments where it's actually like taking a cold shower. You know, we become a bit sort of free of the difficulty of our hiding, and it's actually refreshing. So that's where we become humble and we become a bit more attentive. These two together, deceit and dishonesty, keep us from seeking the good advice of those who could lead us in a positive direction. This is a specific form of unpleasantness or unhappiness called not meeting spiritual friends. So that's where we just sort of keep it to ourselves, and we don't really want to consult anyone. We're not interested in any kind of input. We just stick to our particular formula. And this is a sort of a closed-mindedness, and that's also where we're impervious to the inspiration from those that clearly aren't afflicted the way we are, and even those who have sublime qualities, spiritual friends. One of the things that blocks us from meeting spiritual friends or teachers is being dominated by a deceitful and dishonest heart. It is not a small thing. That's actually a really good line. It is not a small thing. That is beautiful in the statement, and that is exactly it. This is where this is a big downfall, that we essentially just sustain a particular lie and deceit and condition of dishonesty really at the level of our heart. And though that's where we just harden. And that is really, as Stephen said, this is not a small thing. This is where we miss out. We could come so close, and yet also we could miss it. So with the conditions of our intelligence and our honesty and our aspiration and clarity, then we should really be determined not to fall prey to these kind of, you could say, these factors of upset. Self-infatuation, mental inflation. Next, we have the factor of self-infatuation or mental inflation. We all know this feeling, I think. It's called the joy or rapture of thinking about our health, youth, good looks, and our abundance of pleasure. It causes us to be unconcerned or careless with respect to other aspects of life. So this is this sort of rather narcissistic self-absorption in which we're just very happy with who we are and very happy with our sort of credentials and our possessions and so on. So this occasionally happens, and this is sometimes where we think, oddly enough, that this is success. This is where we have succeeded. We can prove, look, I have this, I have created this, I am so-and-so, and all of that. So it could come on the basis of our health, good looks, and also it could come on the abundance of our material possessions or the things that give us pleasure. So that's where it leads us to a rather blind, numb condition of being unconcerned and careless with, you could say, the things that really matter. Just a sec. Hostility, malice. So now we come to the 10th factor, which is translated as malice or as hostility. Malice is associated with anger. It's associated with anger. It is associated with anger, number 2 of the primary factors. It is defined as lacking loving kindness, compassion, and open-heartedness. Let's see, I'm curious what it's about. Number 2, wishing to harm. Wishing to harm. Okay. Yeah, it's defined by the lack of something positive. When we were examining the wholesome factors, we saw that some of them were defined as the lack of something negative. This lack does not mean that nothing is there. It is to say there is a space created that's not filled up. This lack means that there is a space. Yeah, and it's also very often we can understand things in terms of what they're not, right? On the basis of exclusion. So we can very often you'll hear Tantric conservators give the example of how do we describe the taste of salt? Well, we just say, well, it's not sugar, right? So that's where you could say sweetness. Sweetness is the absence of, let's say, sour. And so doesn't mean that there's just a lack, but it also, of course, means that there is something else. So we understand things in terms of basically comparing them to their opposites. When there is a lack of negativity with some of the positive elements, this lack of negativity is itself positive. So that's where we can, very often if we have negative inspirations, impulses, then the mere absence of them in itself gives way to something really beautiful. So the moment that we let go of anger, then there is something really positive that takes place, which is an awareness of other, there's a softness, there's kindness, there's compassion, empathy, etc. Stephen says there's a space for something to come in. In this case, the same principle is involved, but from the opposite perspective. Malice names the energy where there is no loving kindness, no compassion, and no open-heartedness. So we can identify malice thinking, what's loving kindness like? What's compassion like? What's open-heartedness? And then think of the absence of those. No loving kindness. You can it's almost visceral. No compassion, no open-heartedness. It immediately actually gives way for a pretty bleak picture. And that's where then this could even come with then the very opposite, namely wishing to harm. Where there's no loving kindness, no compassion, no open-heartedness, the wishing to harm others. It's said that this lack of loving kindness, compassion, and open-heartedness functions in a specific way. How does it flow? We treat others abusively. That is the definition, and that is its function. For those of us interested in psychology, if you ask the question, why is that person treating that other person abusively? The answer here would be, in part, that temporarily there is no loving kindness, compassion, or open-heartedness in that individual. This is something rather profound. So again, this is important because we're not seeing the other as a malicious person, but actually exactly like Steven very aptly sort of quotes and giving justice to the wisdom of psychology, is that in part that temporarily there is these conditions that are lacking. And so persons are not defined in terms of their shortcomings, but in terms of just lacking positive qualities. So he goes on to say, and in fact, we are not exempt because there is both subtle and gross abuse. There's abuse in the outward, overt expressions through our words and deeds, but there can also be abuse through our thoughts. This is very often sort of something that works on an energetic level. We might be this thing that, what is it again, Ronald Lang? Adi Lang? Yeah. Adi Lang, he talked about the double bind, where, you know, you might have, he was talking about this in terms of child-parent relationships, where the parent might, in terms of their action, their sort of words, might say kind things, but both their body language and particularly their attitudes might be actually anger. And so there's a double bind that takes place in terms of you could say, mixed messages. The child hears kind words, but at the same time senses the, you could say, passive aggressive energy that's below that. And that can be, this is the basis then for his identifying this condition that he refers to as double bind. So that's where there's a difference between subtle and gross abuse. This is one of the reasons why those in the Buddhist tradition put a lot of emphasis on cultivating loving kindness, compassion, and open-heartedness. It's not enough simply to rest in a state of what one calls emptiness. In the traditions that I know, the view and practices of cutting through and emptiness are always mixed with or alternated with practices of loving kindness, compassion, and open-heartedness. And this, of course, is a discussion that's very prevalent within the community of meditation. This is what Steven's referring to, where you very often have persons who would just like to rest in the absolute nature of mind, and yet can't be bothered really to work with the condition of mind that really is the dominant one when we're not resting in that nature. And that constitutes, 99% of the time. And even if we are ostensibly sitting there meditating on the nature of mind, who knows what's actually going on? So that's where it seems as being potentially a big waste if we, on one hand, without sufficient clarity, practice meditation on emptiness, and then also on top of that, if we then for the rest of the time actually ignore the value of what we refer to as the accumulation of merit, namely the being proactive in terms of our body, our speech, and our mind, in which we then train in the practices of loving kindness, compassion, and open-heartedness. Okay. The factors I recognize in myself are very deep and have been there for a long time. It seems difficult to know how to uproot them. Ah, well, you've come to the right place because this is what we deal in. And it is, first of all, on the basis of us identifying it. And once we can identify them, then when we're meditating, we identify how we needn't be prone to these impulses. And that's where the thoughts that essentially embody these factors of upset and then are articulated in terms of narratives, in terms of attitudes, etc., they actually begin to perpetuate this deepening and familiarization with a negative trait. And this is where we can get off, the carousel of these particular patterns. And that's where on one hand we identify this, and like I was mentioning earlier, we can begin to train our mind in the opposite. So these factors that we're talking about here, we can train in their opposites. We can train in loving kindness, as when we've been training ourselves in resentment or in malice. We can train ourselves in detachment when we've perhaps been training ourselves in greed, etc., etc. So all of these we can work with on both a conceptual level, which is what we call lojong practice, and also in terms of meditation, learning to be free of these, you could say, the tyranny of the thoughts and the impulses, and simply just the blind unawareness of the way that we are driven by our thinking unconsciously, or just without being properly onto it. Subtleties are why I find antidotes difficult, because even I try to use loving kindness as an antidote to my stinginess or upset, I know, and the other person may know, it's not authentic. But that's where we're training. We have our little bicycles with its training wheels, and yes, we're definitely not ready for the Tour de France, and we're definitely not great bicyclists, but there we are, managing, wobbling along with our training wheels. That's all right. This is why we are called practitioners, because we're practicing. Okay. All right. I think we haven't quite finished covering malice, but always a worthwhile topic. We'll continue next time. So let's dedicate. Yeah, wobbly is okay. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May Bodhichitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish, evermore and more. Thank you. The next part of the program is meditation, and I'm actually going to stick with a text by Chögyam Trungpa, a very brief text. I've referred to this before, and I very often come back to this as a brilliant overview of the foundations of meditation. And then we'll do the practice of the treasury of blessings, and then we'll do sitting meditation in conjunction with that. So let's just take a 2-minute break if you need to stretch your legs, etc., and we'll be back. So welcome back, and yeah, many of you will. I just think this is such a helpful short outline of meditation. And the thing is also very often there's so many different instructions on meditation out there. So this one here, just because it works and it's simple, I don't see any other reason to really refer to anything else. And there are some, Trungpa gave some more sort of extensive teachings on this, but just at least for the scope of our present program, I think this will suffice. So the practice of meditation. So Trungpa says, the practice of meditation is not so much about a hypothetical attainment of enlightenment as about leading a good life. In order to learn how to lead a good life, a spotless life, we need continual awareness that relates with life constantly, directly, and very simply. So the hypothetical attainment of enlightenment means that this idea of enlightenment is not presently something that's familiar with us. And a lot of the spiritual ideas, dreams, ambitions, hopes, and the language around enlightenment and spirituality very often is very speculative. So Trungpa's point is, it's not so much about that, but rather about us actually relating to our present existence and being what we've just looked at, leading a life in which these factors of upset do not dominate. And that's where we could actually be comfortable with who we are. We could be able to face ourselves, we can have a spotless life, and that requires that we actually are honest and we are relating with the life constantly, directly, and very simply. We don't need to bring in all sorts of vocab, Buddhist vocab. It's about us just relating to what Trungpa also calls the kitchen sink. It's about relating to the people around us in a very simple, direct, caring way, and also essentially dealing with the requirements of our life in a very straightforward way. He says the attitude that brings about mindfulness and awareness is not an opinionated one. Mindfulness is simply about a sense of being. You are in contact. You are actually being there. When you sit on the meditation cushion, you feel you are sitting there and that you actually exist. You don't need to encourage or sustain your sense of being. So again, this is about relating very straightforward to our existence and not bringing in any particular kind of dogma. It's not as if we are meditators and as if we have something particular. Mindfulness and awareness is really just about being in touch. So we don't even need to use Buddhist vocabulary. We don't need to think of this as having anything to do with any ism. It is about us being in touch. And that's also the practice of sitting on the meditation cushion is in fact allowing us to properly relate to our situation, to our existence. We don't need to embellish it or sustain some particular kind of psychological state. It's simply just about honestly being properly present. Now, of course, there's some very radical perspectives that is involved in this. Trungpa goes on to say we might actually question what is the purpose of meditation, what happens next. But actually, the idea of meditation is to develop an entirely different way of dealing with things where you have no purpose at all. One is not constantly on the way to somewhere, or rather, one is on the way and at the destination at the same time. Now, the entire Buddhist project is obviously that we are identifying what causes our suffering and that we need to do something about it, and hence there is a path. We are on a path of transformation. So that's the overall picture, that we are working with our condition and we're very much, yes, on a journey, on a path. But that path, and this maybe is subtle, but also fairly straightforward, that path consists to a large extent of opening up to a dimension in which we are properly present. And that proper presence is not contaminated with some thoughts of ambition, etc. We're not going somewhere. Well, as Trungpa says, we are on the way and at the destination at the same time, because the practice of meditation is not about us sitting waiting for, okay, when is it going to happen? when is this thing that I'm looking for going to take place? But the very method of meditation is actually that we short circuit that, which is a very unhealthy and very, you could say, problematic attitude, which is what's worthwhile is what's coming next, and we're actually never really properly present. And this is where we need to then tap into this famous now, being here now, and all of that is, in fact, this quality of beginning to, you say, bracket out our normal concern with what happened before, what might happen next, and actually beginning to be in touch. And that is where we, in the practice of meditation, we bypass or short circuit that ordinary neurotic escape into what actually is just vacuous, because we are at all times present, and we just fail actually to connect to this presence. So meditation is where we then begin to properly be alive, being properly present. And there we need to let go of our sort of like, what's next? This is also where Trungpa in another place, he talks about the difference between sitting and perching. Because little birds, they will sit and they'll perch because they're very worried about bigger birds and so on, and they never really sit properly. But what we're doing here, we're sitting like a big fat orangutan. We're sitting with our butts properly in the present and actually not perching nervously, but properly connecting to reality, properly connecting to presence. So these first three paragraphs really sort of highlight, you could say, the attitude that is very helpful that we bring to meditation. The next few paragraphs, they're more about technique. And so Trungpa says, our posture and sitting practice is important. Sitting cross-legged is recommended, with the spine straight, not stiff, so that the breath is not strained or inhibited. However, imposing too much intensity on the body will undermine the whole thing. So you can rearrange your posture as necessary. If there is some physical problem that makes sitting on the floor too difficult, a chair can be used, but it is best not to lean against the back. So that's where we need to obviously not be rigid, militant in our approach. We need to engage our body with kindness, but also provide really a wholehearted, upbeat condition that is somewhat tonified by our holding ourselves with the lower back. So we could sit up, we're very welcome to sit on a chair. There's no need to sit on the floor, but it's important that however we sit, that we're not leaning, and we're certainly not slouching, but we are developing this wholehearted participation in terms of our body language. And we do this with this tonified condition of sitting straight, but again, not like a poker up our ass, but very much with this just sort of supple condition of sitting straight. Also, we take our shoulders a little bit back, we take the chin in a little bit. We sit like the Buddha, basically. Eyes remain open, but if we're paying, eyes remain open, but if we're paying too much attention to visual details and colors, the head and neck may tighten. We simply rest the gaze slightly downward without trying to focus on anything. Now, persons who have practiced meditation with closed eyes before, they might find that opening the eyes initially, we tend to sort of look at the objects in the front, but that's actually only a condition where we're distracted. Once we just come back to the breath, then we actually very quickly just rest the gaze without any particular concern of what's in our field of vision. So again, this is about us simply just relaxing and coming back to the breath. Trungpa then says, as you exhale, follow the breath outward. Try to actually identify with it rather than just watching it. That means that we actually go with the breath. Our attention is with the breath. So that's where we're not focused elsewhere. The in-breath naturally follows when the lungs are empty. Just let it happen without particularly paying attention to it. So this means that we are more proactive in terms of putting our attention on the out-breath, and we just allow a gap during the in-breath. He says it's very important to avoid becoming overly solemn, feeling that one is taking part in some special ritual. One should simply try to identify oneself with the breath. There are no ideas of analyzing involved. So this is where we are in a way fortunate that mindfulness has become quite mainstream. At this point, I think most people actually are willing to sit and meditate without it necessarily they're thinking that they're doing a Buddhist thing or they're doing something odd. I think most people are pretty much okay with this. So I don't think people nowadays, to that extent, think of meditation as a special ritual. But of course, if you're a Vajrayana practitioner, then it's very important to also have that same attitude when you are engaging in Vajrayana ritual, which of course is really, again, just like the practice of yoga, ways of aligning ourselves with an awake condition. So just like when you're doing yoga practice, then after a while, you don't particularly think of it as being a ritual, anything special. You're just really adapting a posture because it's very helpful. So regardless of what we're doing on the path, we should never really have this kind of obsession with or getting overly solemn or serious and so on. We just identify the value of this, and we simply just, without much further ado, we just do it. So that's where we sit and we identify with the breath. We don't necessarily need to make a big drama, or we don't need to analyze it in a greater degree. Whenever thoughts arise, just observe them as thoughts and label them thinking. What usually happens when we have thoughts is that we absorb ourselves and cease to be aware that we're thinking at all. This is what happens, right? We are lost. We're lost in thought, and we know this from ourselves, we know it from others, and we don't necessarily, when others are lost in thought and we sort of bring them back saying, hello, nobody's really going anywhere, or it's not like we're sort of going into a zone. It's actually just that we're coming out of a zone. So in meditation, we don't go into a zone. We're actually coming out of the zone that we're in our inattentiveness, our unawareness, our ignorance, our just, you could say, mindlessness. So introducing mindfulness, coming back to being present, is really just that we discontinue our absent-mindedness. And that's where whatever happens, including also the thoughts that arise, we simply just view them as, yeah, I'm having thoughts. So what? CCL is the acronym that Trungpa Rinpoche coined, which really just means couldn't care less. At the time that we're meditating, we might have all sorts of thoughts come up. And yes, we can deal with them whenever we want, and we can, if we must, sure. But when we're meditating, the method actually consists of, at that time, not feeding the drama. And that's where we just refer to this as, yes, there's thoughts coming up, and we come back to the breath in the sense that we are allowing ourselves to not be absorbed, not being controlled by, and not being sucked in by the thoughts. So he says, one should try not to suppress thoughts in meditation, but just try to see their transitory nature, their translucent nature. They come, and we know they pass. When we're talking to others and they're going through something, then we can tell them, well, it will pass. This applies to our thoughts. They will pass. But we can, of course, perpetuate them a lot, but in and of themselves, thoughts are just taking place within the present moment. They're a manifestation of our consciousness, but they're taking place within the present, and they're really just like, you could say, in such a language that we have the word display or adornment, which might sound very nice and all of that. But then again, we might sometimes have issues with whatever thoughts arise, and that's where sometimes can be difficult. There's a beautiful passage in Milarepa in which he teaches a woman called Paldabum, and he says, leave your mind like an ocean. She says, well, there's a lot of waves on that ocean. He says, well, the waves are no different from the ocean. He says, leave your mind like a mountain. She says, well, there's a lot of trees and shrubs and greenery growing on that mountain. He says, that's the nature of the mountain. And what else? And similarly also with the sky. There might be clouds in the sky, but the sky itself is untouched by that. And that's where we are aware of the thoughts that arise. We allow them to be there, but yes, yet they don't become the dominant factor. We're aware of them, we're not suppressing them, but we're just allowing them to arise, and we see their translucent nature. Trungpa says we do not become involved in them or reject them, but simply acknowledge them and then come back to the awareness of breathing. There should be no deliberate effort to control and no attempt to be peaceful. Our thoughts simply cease to be the VIPs in our lives. This is where we need to be aware that thoughts are controlling us. We might just think this is important, this is good, this is bad, but in fact, these are just labels that we're attributing to apparent realities. And that's where we need to see through the hoax that is behind this control, this grip that our thoughts have on us, in which they, strangely enough, they dominate us, they control us. They are the VIPs, the bosses, and the tyrants in our lives. Trungpa then says, on the other hand, there's no implication that by sitting and meditating, coming back to the breath, we have found a way to avoid problems and escape from one point to another. Meditation is not a quick cure or cover-up for the complicated or embarrassing aspects of ourselves. It is a way of life. It is extremely important to persist in our practice without second-guessing ourselves through disappointments, elations, or whatever. We might actually begin to see the world we carry with us in a more open, refreshing way. Meditation is very much a matter of exercise, a working practice. It is not a matter of going into some imaginary depth, but of widening and expanding outward. And this is why meditation comes with what we call vipassana, a greater perspective. We become greater minds. We become more accepting, more open, more willing to impose less censorship on our experiences. We're less fussy about what's happening. And that also means that we're not particularly retreating into some alternative comfort zone in which the embarrassing or complicated or uncomfortable aspects of ourselves simply just were to go away. What we're doing is embracing an openness, and that is a way of life. It's not just limited to when we're meditating. It is about us no longer being distracted and caught up unconsciously or mindlessly in these underlying narratives. And that's where we begin to open up to a greater, more accommodating, wider perspective. So we talk about, like Trungpa says here, widening and expanding outward. So he concludes, these instructions are presented as the basic foundation of meditation practice. It's important to follow these guidelines to ensure a good understanding at the beginning. So this comes from a wonderful work called The Truth of Suffering and the Path of Liberation. Now we're going to do, we practice meditation here in conjunction with a beautiful liturgy. And this, of course, very much is on the premise that we are comfortable with and have trust in the Buddha. Some of us have taken refuge in the Buddha, which means that we acknowledge that the Buddha got to the bottom of things. We're not just seeing Buddha as a sage who got into a blissful mode and who then sort of encouraged others to say, hey, there's a great trick, you know, you can avoid all the problems that you normally have, you can create meaning in your existence, etc. But rather we take refuge in the Buddha as somebody who got to the bottom of what ails the universe, who got to the bottom of where does suffering comes from. So this is no small thing. And so this is where the invoking the Buddha is not just about us invoking some great hero, but very much about us instilling the present project of meditation with the presence of the Buddha as someone who embodies what we are aspiring to in the practice of meditation, namely to penetrate through to truth and to enjoy this quality of truth is something that we can actually engage with already now. When we, for example, are inspired by a great person, a great teacher, and in this case, we invoke the Buddha, there's a sense of the ordinary concepts that we normally struggle with fall away. In the presence of the teacher, there's a condition of greater openness, a condition of inspiration in which we see a greater potential for our existence. And that's where we have this experience of what we call blessing, where there's actually something that penetrates our ordinary, you could say, flow of worries and narratives, etc., and something greater is introduced, a sacred dimension that we recognize because it's basic to us. And that's where we're not idolizing the Buddha, but really invoking the Buddha as a reflection of our own natural basic disposition, our own potential, if you like. So this is something that takes place when there's great devotion. And again, like we talked about earlier, we train in devotion. We're not naturally, especially us in the modern world of very egalitarian thinking, we might be adverse to the idea of someone or something greater. But I think we can acknowledge that there are sometimes something to be learned, and there is very often something beautiful when we can be touched by greatness, when we allow ourselves to actually be open to greatness. And it's that place, that humble place also, that there's a sense of connecting to something beautiful. And at that point, we're not really objectifying the beauty as external, but very much connecting with it as innate. And so that's where we talk about blessing on the basis of the conditions of openness as humble, what's it called? Interested humility, and essentially openness, a deep sense of respect and appreciation. So that's where we then chant this liturgy, really to invoke this condition as a preliminary for then the practice of meditation. And this we do all across the board, really, in all the many Buddhist traditions. It might be through reading some of the sutras, or it might be in Vajrayana, we talk about Guru Yoga, and there's many ways of doing it. In general, this practice that we're doing here is referred to as Buddha Anusmriti. Sangha Rinpoche has, over the last few years, been presenting this practice that is known as Chi Ratna Anusmriti, recollecting the three Buddhas. And he compiled a very beautiful liturgy, actually, which I think the Indian Siddhartha's intent, they practice on Sundays. And also in general, Rinpoche has talked a lot about the Bhumi Sparsha, which is the earth-touching mudra of the Buddha, which is very inspiring, because we're not talking about the Buddha sort of levitating or doing something miraculous, but really just the enlightenment of the Buddha is being in touch, touching the ground, the earth. And so enlightenment is not about us going into some extraordinary dimension, but rather about us being in touch. And so that's where the Buddha is a great inspiration. So that's where, when we do the practice of the treasury of blessings, this is then sort of along the lines of what Tsongtse Rinpoche has been instructing his students here over the last few years. Okay. So we'll just take a 2-minute break again, if you need to just stretch your legs, and then we will begin the practice. Thank you very much. So we're gonna do this program like we normally do. Oh, hold on. My indispensable timekeeper here seems to have gone on strike. Just a second. But we're doing the program as we normally do. So of course we have 15 minutes of sitting, and then 5 minutes of mindful walking, and then again 15 minutes of sitting. My timekeeper seems to have run out of juice, but I think there's an alternative. Okay. So we'll be okay. Yeah. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky, amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel-lined throne and lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks. Clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture. His right hand gracefully poised in the earth, touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding an alms bowl full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 close suns, 16 elders and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss, liberation from samsara and nirvana, the 2 extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues of body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teachings ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, I'm accumulating now and will accumulate in the future. For the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased. And may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness caring for us with surpassing compassion, Every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher Bhagavan, Tathagata Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yata o muni muni maha munaya soha. 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 Deyato muni muni maha munaya soha. Deyato muni muni maha munaya soha. Om 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 Muni Maha Munaya Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations, and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to arise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas endowed with the divine way, the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhichitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all sentient beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those, supreme among humans, to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhammadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings, no life forms. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of the self. May I realize the Dhammatā where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping on to a self and mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with a flawless ethics that is guided by rules, and an ethics that is completely pure, with an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's strife, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in the Bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta precious and sublime arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world, may the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stitiyavat Yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukani nignata akashasya stiti yavacha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukani nignata tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukani nignata tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. And okay, there was just somebody who's, as you can imagine, I'm just not terribly hurried right now, so sure. Who are the two compassionate smiles? Well, I'm glad that you asked. This is this is a father and child. The father being Kangyur Rinpoche, who was a tremendous, great sage, and who recently, actually, there was a movie made about one of his students, a New Zealand, a Kiwi student of his that returned to where he lived in India. And together with that story about the Kiwi student there, then actually there's a lot about Kangyur Rinpoche, who was born in the late 19th century, died in January 1975, and who was an extraordinary Lama. And he actually made prayers that for his Western students. He had some students, and the movie actually tells a bit about it. The movie, by the way, is called Return to Gandhi Road. But anyway, he had some Western students, and he made prayers that they might be guided on the path, and particularly he entrusted his oldest son with responsibility for that, and also asked Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche and Dudjom Rinpoche to also attend to his Western students. And as such, really, the activity that flourished in France, in Dordogne, has a lot to do with the young man sitting in his lap, who is Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche, who is also a tuku of the previous Tsongse Khyentse Rinpoche, Chugilodra, and who, together with his brother, then Tuku Pema Wangyal, and also his third brother and sisters, actually have succeeded in bringing the Dharma to the West in a very great way, and in a very sort of gentle and subtle way. They're very low key, and yet they are high impact. So for example, Padmakara translations, Padmakara translation groups, and also some 3 retreats and so on, are really happening due to these great beings. So Kangyur Rinpoche and Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche. So a lot to be said about them, but I'll leave it at that for today. Thank you very much for joining me here, and all the very best wishes for your practice, your good health, and well-being. See you again.